After their short vacation, the students came back to class. The first day, everyone was going back to their prospective classrooms. There was those as they slithered across the floor, others pranced, others seemed to climb on the walls. Some simply flew in and landed outside, having to tuck their wings in so that they could crawl inside and walk to their classes. But there was one there that stood out. It was a ghost. This ghost was a feline female, with their ears tucked back and a dazed look on their face. Gregnar walked through the hallways, completely oblivious of everything that was going on. She didn't hear the students talking. She barely could see anyone in front of her. In fact, her autonomics were the only reason that she was able to walk at all without running into anything. And as she made it towards class, she didn't even hear her brother scream and wave to her to try and get her attention. She simply went into her class, sat down, and just as before, opened up her tablet to go to the next lesson inside the text that they had to read. The next module was something she already knew, as it was about a species that was only 1 sectors away from hers, but she didn't even notice it. She barely noticed anything. As the class began, she simply went through the motions, not realizing anything. What was truly going through her head was the events of what had happened out during vacation. After the night in which they had listened to Vince and his girlfriend have their little mating session, although they knew nothing would happen as far as offspring was concerned, at least they didn't think so. Humans were not noted to be able to reproduce with anything other than other humans, so this left at least that portion to be okay. As she tried to get an explanation from Larry about what CRISPR was, and he was being quite vague about it. Apparently, this was something humans did all the time. It was very common for them to alter themselves, but not all humans could mentally handle the alteration itself. She didn't understand this, and she wouldn't know until later, but what happened soon after this conversation started was enough to shock them both. As Vince showed up with his wonderful girlfriend draped over his shoulder, some weird-looking facial expression, which Larry called a fecal matter-consuming grin. Gernekdar was still trying to figure out what that meant as she had to double-check her translator, but it said it was correct. Greknar was confused as she simply watched Vince carry his naked girlfriend in over his shoulder, giving everyone a view of her posterior. He simply walked over the tent and slowly and very, very carefully laid her down, and then walked over, grabbed one of the ethyl alcohols they call beers, popped it open, and continued to drink next to Larry. They began to joke a little bit, laughing a little, and Gregnar was completely confused. There didn't seem to be too many words tossed between the two, but they both seemed to laugh and smile, and then they simply raised their containers full of poison and clipped them together. Gregnar remembers that she was too intoxicated at this point to care, as she slowly got up, excused herself, fell over, and crawled on all fours to the tent, and ended up, spooning next to Femcast. Femcast didn't even seem to be bothered, as she simply curled up on top of Gregnar, not realizing that she was spooning with another female. Both Larry and Vince were joking about this as Gregnar drifted off to sleep. She woke up in the middle of the night, having to relieve herself badly, and as she got out, she could see that Larry and Vince were both at high alert. She looked around, and suddenly she felt something. It was as though a predator was watching. She still had to relieve herself, but she didn't know what was going on. Now mostly sober, she walked over to Larry and asked, "What's wrong?" Larry simply raised a finger to his mouth and said, "Shh, listen." With that, she listened close, but she couldn't hear much, at least not for about 20 seconds. Both Larry and Vince were still on high alert, Vince slowly reaching down and grasping that long weapon that they had, the long projectile weapon they had brought with them. With that, Larry reached into one of his bags and he pulled out a pair of metal blades, long metal blades, one of which was as long as his forearm and the other one about as long as his hand. They both seemed to be on edge. They both seemed to be walking around, looking into the darkness, but being as quiet as possible. Gregnar realized this was going on. She was more confused at this. As she watched, Larry walked over, took the longer blade, and put it into her paw and said, "Get to the tent. Anything comes in that's not us, shove this through their eye, and then don't stop. Do it again and keep hacking till whatever it is either runs away or stops moving." Gregnar was now very, very nervous. She wanted to know what was going on, what was out there, but she did listen. She went over to Femcast, still sleeping peacefully, curled up in a little ball, which made Gregnar kind of laugh because this is the way her children of her species usually sleep, curled up in a little ball. Adults tend to spread out, but she didn't have time to make any noise. Eventually, Vince and Larry reached up, pulled out several things they called flashlights, turned them on, and began to illuminate the forest. As they began to move the lights back and forth, Gregnar could hear them whispering to each other. What little bit she could hear was not good. "You see him? I got 2. Note 3. Crap, there's another one. Surrounded." Not a word she wanted to hear. With that, Larry reached down, grabbed a couple pieces of wood, and threw them onto the fire, illuminating more of the landscape. Whatever was out there didn't like fire. And as Vince stayed by the fire with his weapon at the ready, seemingly pulling the buttstock of it into his shoulder, but keeping the barrel down low as though a safety, just to make sure he didn't shoot himself or shoot Larry or anyone else. But he was ready. Everything was tense. Larry walked over to Gregnar and reached into one of his bags and then produced a belt with some sort of metal on it. Without skipping a beat, even without releasing the blade that was still in his hand, he buckled the belt onto himself, switched the blade to his other hand, and then reached and pulled another device, a metal device, from its holster, and then moved into a certain pose. This pose was strange. It was pointing the blade forward, but underneath this strange device. Gregnar thought for a moment, and then realized this was another projectile weapon system. What was with humans and their projectiles? Why do they love them so much? Maybe this is why they're so good at the games. But why hold it like that? She wouldn't have to wait long to find out. She could hear something pushing on the end of the tent, and before she even realized it, Larry had jumped to the other side, spun around, and she could hear bang, bang, bang as he began to fire round after round. This made Femcast jump up out of her sleeping bag and then start screaming about what was going on. Gregnar had to grab a hold of her and get her to shut up by putting a paw over her face and telling her to shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, as shots still began to ring out. Then she could hear something. Larry jumping around and seemingly something was being cut or slashed. She couldn't understand what was going on. She could hear him cursing as more and more was being thrown around in the darkness. She couldn't hear what was going on. Then suddenly, bang, bang, more shots were being fired from the other side of the tent. Vince was over next to the fire, which was only maybe 20 feet from the tent, but he was still watching out, looking out with the rifle in one hand and the flashlight in the other as he continued to scope the outside, waiting for anything to come in. And as something else did, he simply raised the rifle. Kabam! And a screech was heard, and then whatever it was he hit ran off into the darkness. And with that, all the rest took off running. There was then silence. Gregnar jumped up. She was about to leave, but Femcast was in her arms, just shaking, uncontrollably shaking, and gripping on to Gregnar so she wouldn't let go. Gregnar thought about clawing her off, but wait a minute. Femcast was a friend of hers. She didn't want to hurt her. What was going on? With that, Vince ran over, still weapon at the ready. You girls okay? Tell me you're okay. Are you hurt? Where's Larry? Gregnar simply stated, around back. Hey, Larry! Larry, you alive? Larry then slowly walked around the corner. Yeah, I'm alive. Covered in blood, almost from head to toe of splatter. The blade still dripping a strange, dark red from it. It was as though it was human blood, almost. The weapon itself, not the blade, but the projectile, seemed to have blood splatter all over it. It still had its slide forward, so it still had ammo in it. And with that, without skipping a beat, he simply pressed a button, a piece of metal dropped from the bottom, and another piece of metal was inserted with a click. Well, can't say we weren't expecting those. I didn't expect them to be this quick. Yeah, you bet your ass. Speaking of which, did you get one? Oh yeah, put one almost between its eyes. I think I blew one of its arms off, but we're not going to be able to see till tomorrow morning. Good shot. Blind shot? More or less, yeah. Dude, you could always shoot the dick off a fly, I swear. With that, they both shared a hearty laugh, as Femcast was still shaking uncontrollably. But that is when Vince, in mid-laughter, turned and looked at her with the fear in her eyes, and he simply shouldered the rifle and simply reached down. Femcast released Gregnar and then reached up and grabbed him and squeezed him so tight. Oh, whoa, easy, you're gonna bruise me. Oh, shit, you squeeze me any harder, you're gonna squeeze out a fart. Hold on, good God, oh shit. Larry started chuckling. Yeah, you're gonna break him. But Femcast would not let go. She was too afraid of what was going on. She had no idea what was out there. Gregnar eventually got out and asked, What was back there? I don't think it was the same thing he shot at. You want to see? With that, Gregnar simply followed him. Clicking on the flashlight, they went behind the tent, and the scene behind there was something out of one of those screen things that humans like to watch called horror. Several different predator species, small predator species, not much bigger than a Vemcha, was there. Actually, as she looked, they were a little smaller. They looked mammalian, almost as though they were flat on the back, but squat and almost rodent-like. They had a strange stripe going down their back. Do we hit some skunks? I hope not, Larry said, as just kind of a side comment. This comment went right over Gretnar's head, as she couldn't believe that Larry had just taken these all on by himself. She looked closer and could see that most actually died from gunshot wound, but the others had been sliced apart. One of them looked like it had taken a knife straight to the chest. Then she looked at the knife itself, and sure enough, the blood track was perfectly lined up. This thing had jumped at him. No wonder he kept the knife forward. And that is when Gretnar realized that these humans were just really good at killing things. With that, she looked over at Larry, who was simply trying to knock the blood off some of his knife and simply trying to put it back into its sheath. She looked him over as the wet blood forced his clothing to stick to his built frame, and she felt that flush of heat again. She tried to shake it off and tried to walk away, but as she went closer, she got a whiff of not only the blood, but also Larry himself, and again got very flushed. She suddenly stumbled and almost fell over. Are you okay? Larry said as he reached down to help. Gregnar, waving her paw, went, No, I'm fine, as she got herself composed and went back into the tent. For that entire night, the females were able to sleep inside the tent as the men held watch. Waking up the next morning, she could smell something pleasant, something very, very good. She climbed out of the tent and looked over towards the fire, and she saw Vince and Larry looking at something on the fire itself, seeming to have a small conversation. As she got closer, she realized the pleasant aroma was cooking meat. Not only that, but they had found a way to season it. She couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. She simply looked and started to drool at the idea of having fresh cooked meat in front of her. Even though she was more inclined to have it raw, the smell of it was intoxicating. As she got close, she could hear Vince trying, perfect timing. It's almost ready. As he looked up, Larry reached over with his knife and jabbed a large piece of meat, raised it up, and said, "Oh no, for her, trust me, it's ready." And he raised it up so that Gregnar could actually grab a hold of it. She then pulled it off the blade of the knife, being careful not to cut her paw, and then took a small sniff of the meat, having to readjust her hands from the heat, and then taking a large bite, ripping a large section off, and savoring every last bit of it. She didn't know what the seasoning was, but it seemed to work absolutely perfect with it. She then purred in delight. This made both of the human males look at each other and then chuckle. Gregnar didn't know, nor did she care, that the humans found this amusing. She simply began to consume the rest of the meat with reckless abandonment, as once it hit her stomach, her entire system said, "More." And with that, she began to look for even more food to eat. But it would take a moment for another large piece to be done. But there wasn't any around. Gregnar simply asked, "Well, what are you going to have?" "Oh, we already had breakfast," Larry said. "But we can get you more. Hold on." He simply stood up, walked behind the tent, and came out later producing another one of those creatures that tried to kill him from earlier. Gregnar cringed for a moment at the idea that she had just eaten one of these things. She didn't even know what they were. This planet wasn't hers. She had no idea if this was going to be toxic to her or not. The humans didn't seem to care, as they simply would pull up another small chunk of meat, barely big enough to fit in the palm of her paw, and chew on it. The humans seemed to enjoy the flavor just as much. And she watched with surprise as Larry would butcher this creature, cutting it open with seeming ease, using the same knife he had killed it with, slicing it from anus to neck, and then peeling the skin off with practiced precision, and then pulling out all the intestines, bringing many of them over towards the lake that they had caught the fish and throwing it in. She could see that many of the fish seemed to be waiting for this as they began to bubble up to the surface and start tearing at the intestines themselves, seemingly enjoying their meal. Larry came back with several things in hand. He simply put them on sticks and put them next to the fire to cook. With that, he took the largest pieces of meat and laid it across a handmade grill that they had pieced together. You would think they had brought one with them, but turns out they're just too heavy to carry on a large track like that. The humans seemed to enjoy cooking things up, but that was not the biggest surprise. The biggest surprise was as it was cooking, Larry pulled out one of those, what they call rounds, cartridges, bullets from the large weapon, used a tool to pull the projectile off, tossing it off to the side, and then sprinkling the contents onto the meat. Gregnar put both hands up and protested for them to stop, and they simply looked and said, No, wait for the surprise. She couldn't understand. They then grabbed the meat with their knife, flipped it over, and instantly all the projectile chemicals caught fire. Within a moment, she then realized this was the seasoning. This is what gave the meat its wonderful flavor. She didn't understand. Why would they use a food to go get other food. Wait a moment. This was a spice. This made sense, though. You use a little bit of spice to get a large amount of food. Okay, maybe these humans know what they're doing out here in the woods after all. Although it did still confuse her, as humans don't have claws, don't have fangs, don't even have a tail, don't have horns, don't have wings. They're just squishy pink things. Why would they know how to do this so well? I know he's much older, Gregnar thought. But why? How? Huh? With that, she waited for her piece of meat, and they simply took half of the creature itself, split it down the center once it was done cooking, and handed it over to Gregnar, who squatted down and immediately began consuming all of it and enjoying the flavor immensely. And as she was just finishing up and enjoying the full stomach she had, Femcas walked up and asked for what's for breakfast. Vince simply went to say something, and then Larry chimed in with his hand up, blocking Vince from saying anything. Young lady, if we told you, you'd never eat it. Then taking a knife, stabbing a piece of meat, and presenting it to Femcas. Femcas is not really one for consuming any type of meat that doesn't swim, was hesitant at first, but eventually enjoyed it. Being that it was cooked, it was nice and tender, and also full of adrenaline from the fight before. After breakfast, they all went to see where Vince had shot that whatever it was that screamed into the night, and as he thought, they found an arm, a fur-covered arm with a claw at the end. It was almost predatory. Larry and Vince looked at him and said the same word. Bear. It bears what? It bears repeating? It bears a likeness to something? Gregnar didn't know and kept asking, and eventually was told that it's very similar to something they have on their own planet. Hold on, wait a minute. You're telling me you have predators this large on your planet, and you're the apex predator? Yup, Vince said, extremely confidently, as he stood up with his chest out. And with that, he looked over, and Femcas was a little frightened at what she saw on the ground. Larry went and picked it up and said, well, at least we got lunch. And Vince went over and hugged Femcas so that she would stop shaking. Her species was not a predatory species, really. Not very high on. In fact, every time they went in any of the games, they lost horribly. Yet, to human eyes, they're rather cute, the little blue-skinned girls. Although the straight-up fish-looking of the males left a bit to be desired by most human females. This was not what was anything of concern, at the moment at least. Gregnar looked and was amazed that Larry once again butchered this piece with unbelievable precision, even saving almost all of the meat there, but taking all the waste and once again tossing it in the lake. This time, the fish in the lake had a lot of trouble getting through the hide, but they still consumed it. Gregnar asked, why do you give that to the fish? Can't you eat that? What, the hide? No, we can't use the hide. I don't have time to tan that shit. Do you want to sit here for the next 6 months pissing on it? It's the only way to tan it out here. Why would you urinate on it? Makes it soft, Larry said, kind of confused. Gregnar didn't want to push it because humans were weird anyway. Yet, when they got back, the arm of whatever the hell it was immediately dropped onto the grill and cooked up very, very slowly. The grill was raised up a little bit so that it was mostly smoked, and it would be their lunch. Gregnar and Femcas were both very, very nervous that the sun was starting to go down again, but Vince and Larry weren't concerned at all. They seemed nonchalant at the whole idea. Why were they so calm? They couldn't figure it out. This time, the girls were able to pass out just as soon as the sun went down, and they stayed asleep the whole night. When they woke up, they saw that Vince was passed out inside the tent, and Larry was outside tending the fire, sitting there with a rifle slung across his chest. He looked as though he was watching out for any type of trouble that might come, but none had. Now they had an issue, though. They were out of food. Though there were a couple fish cooking on the grill, they would need something else for the next 2 days until their transport came to get them. And that is when they surprised Gretnar again. As everyone was eating, Larry simply took the long rifle, gave the small projectile pistol to Vince, and said, "All right, I'll be back with dinner," and then began to walk towards the woods. Gretnar couldn't believe what she was seeing. She asked Vince, "What is he doing?" "Oh, he's going hunting." "Hunting?" "Oh yeah, he's gonna go get us some food. Maybe he'll blast out one of those bears again. That'd be a good meal." How's he gonna do that?" "He's gonna do something that we humans are really good at." "What's that?" "Being real sneaky." Gretnar realized that this was true, as humans were extremely sneaky when it came to the games, but she didn't know how this would help it procure any type of food. Usually they used thermal scans to find where something was and then send out a drone. The drones would simply go, stun the animal, land, and then put a bolt through the back of its spinal column, and then it was done. With the brainstem severed, the animal was done, and then the drone would simply bring it back and do the butchering for them. That was the way of things now. Technology had reached that point that most people didn't even see the animals that they were consuming. But now these humans are not only out here living by sleeping on the dirt, living in this primitive makeup of a shelter, cooking everything over a fire, procuring their own food, boiling their own water. Humans are weird. About midday, they heard the bang, and they wondered what was going on, if that was a good bang or another bang. Vince simply said, "Don't worry, you hear a second one? In about a minute, we're good. If you hear another one really quick, then you're in trouble. If you hear 3 or 4 real quick, he's fucked." "Why would he be mated?" Gretnar asked. "It's not... Never mind." With that, about 30 minutes later, they could see Larry coming, dragging something very large behind him. That something very large was, in fact, something that looked very similar to a bear from Earth. The major difference was the fact that it didn't have 4 limbs. It had 8. The head was also much, much larger and a bit pushed into the body, seeming like this was a bear type of spider without the massive abdomen sticking out the back. It was odd to look at. Vince looked at it and said, "God damn, that thing's creepy. Whoa, shit. You couldn't have freaking skinned it out there?" "Well, not without, destroying half the meat on the way here." "Ugh, dude, ugh." "Hey, I shot it, you're cleaning it. That was the deal." "Oh, man." Vince was more than a little put back at this, as he took the blades and then dragged the spider bear thingy over towards the lake so he could clean it up. As he was cleaning it, you could see him chucking more and more things into the water, and the fish inside seemingly enjoying their meal. Eventually, they had more than enough food for the perceivable future. But they forgot about one thing: Gretnar's extreme appetite. While Larry was off getting their food, they had not been static. They had to go and get enough firewood. They had set more things up so they would be a bit more comfortable, basically making their own small little chairs. They also plussed up the shelter so that they wouldn't have to worry about something sneaking up to them at night, using something, basically a fence covered in any type of spines that they could find. Any type of spiky tree was used for this purpose. They asked, "Why do this when you can just shoot them?" "What if they come back from the other side again? You're just lucky Larry was here." That is when Greknar kind of shrugged and went, yeah, and Femcast again started to shake. She was more and more nervous about this, but Vince was very quick to see her get nervous and then pick her up and hold her. Being so much larger than she was made her feel safe as he held her in his arms. Not to mention, Vince was much larger than Larry as far as the depth of his arms or width and everything else. He was just a larger man, even though he wasn't much taller, maybe half a centimeter, if that. That night they ate very well and were again able to sleep through the night. This time Larry was in the tent, but he was curled up off to the side. As Gretnar went to wake him up, he began to roll over a little bit, and she was a little nervous. She thought this was going to be some sort of twitch. But as he laid there, she looked over and just kind of stared. She gave her version of a smile a little bit, and then she felt flushed again. Shaking that off, she realized it was morning and she needed to wake him up. She reached over, grabbed him on the shoulder, and shook a little bit. Larry, it's who? With that, Larry jumped up, immediately threw Gretnar to the ground, throwing his forearm across her neck. His knees were up on her arms, making sure she couldn't move. He immediately drew his knife, drew his hand back, and then stopped. Breathing very heavy, Gretnar was looking up, scared out of her mind with the murderous intent that Larry had in his eyes. Larry came back to reality and went from, I'm going to kill you look to, oh shit. He simply lowered the blade, took his hands off Gretnar's neck, and helped her up and said, don't ever do that again. Why did you do that? Gretnar was shaking at this. Femcast saw the whole thing and almost peed herself at that point. Larry just calmed himself down. Vince ran over. Dude, you okay? Not even checking on Gretnar, but checking on Larry. This confused her. Yeah, I'm good. I'm good, Larry kept saying. I'm good, as he put the knife away and continued to seemingly try to lower his heart rate. Why did he do that? Gretnar asked Vince. It's called PTSD. Remember when we told you that we were soldiers back in the day? Yeah, a fighter in the past, a warrior. Why? Listen, a lot of times we do things that is beyond what our psychology can manage, okay? If this happens, we have an issue like you just saw. Now, normally it only takes about a second for us to realize where we are, but sometimes we think we were where we were back when all that was going on. It's a defense mechanism that we humans have, and it's just there. You're just going to have to deal with it. Gretnar was confused and then asked, does that mean I can never wake him up from a sleep again? No. That doesn't mean that. Vince was very adamant about this, waving his hands as a gesture to try and make sure she knew. No. It's fine. Just next time you have to wake him up, you see his feet? Yeah. Either slap him in the foot, kick him in the foot, and tell him it's time to get up, okay? That's something where we say, hey, it's time for you to be on guard. You shake on the shoulder, that is, you have to be in killing mode right now. Killing mode? Femcast asked as she was getting more and more nervous being around humans in their more natural habitat. Vince simply looked over, took her by the hand. No, baby, no. You will never be in my killing mode. You're more in my other mode. He began to grin at Femcast, and Femcast seemed to again blush, but when her species blushed, they tend to go pale. With that, Gretnar, without saying a word, excused herself. Larry, realizing what's going on, immediately walked out as well, and then simply grabbed the front of the tent and dropped it, giving them some privacy. Larry and Gretnar went over to the fire and cooked themselves their breakfast, using again another one of the bullets to kind of season the meat itself. They realized that they had way more than they needed, and they were only going to be out there one more day. They would have to start their walk back soon. Greknar was very, very enlightened on what she had seen thus far, but she was simply amazed. How was a human able to take down something like this? I know he had a projectile weapon, but these how that was a big creature. One bullet. It's all it took. It's not like he could just sit and wait for it to walk by. He had to actually stalk this thing. With that, Greknar asked, "How did you take this thing down?" In between bites, he swallowed, and Larry said, "Well, you underestimate the sneakiness." Greknar, again, tried to shake it off and was just surprised at this. How in the flying farts was he able to do this? They can't be that sneaky. I know they're able to beat everybody in the games, but how? With that, she didn't pay too much attention as she began to enjoy profusely the meat seasoned with gunpowder. She would have to show this to her family when she got back, but she was still surprised at the whole thing. It wasn't until later that day that she got a big, big shock. She saw that others of the species, that bear spider hybrid, had shown up. Maybe following the smell, maybe this was one of their kin, it didn't matter. But then she saw Larry and Vince get ready again. Vince once again had the large weapon, and Larry again had his sidearm with his knife at the ready. They once again told the girls to stay close to the fire, but this time it was in broad daylight. How was this going to work? With that, the creatures howled up into the sky and then began to charge. Both Vince and Larry began to move their heads back and forth, looking around to see if there was any others, but no, 4 of these numbers came running at them. Vince raised his weapon and fired. With that, one of the spider things dropped right where it was. No sound or anything like that. The bullet piercing right through its head as it collapsed on the ground. Another one, seemingly trying to move around the body itself, jumped up, and Vince shot again, this one catching it in the chest. It gave out a small "Arr!" as it landed on the ground with a thud and crumpled into a heap. The other 2 continued to charge in. This time, they began to move sideways, left and right and left and right. There was no way to get an actual shot off. They seemed to have figured it out, that every single time they ran forward, they were going to get hit. This is when Larry bolted towards them, straight at one of them, trying to get its attention. And as it locked on Larry and began to run straight again, another shot came out, and down it went. One left. But this one was too close. This one jumped forward and was able to get onto Larry. He drove his knife into his chest, and then, without seemingly any hesitation, it landed on him. And then Greknar watched as it was suddenly catapulted into the air, seemingly confused what the hell just happened, as she looked as 2 legs were sticking up, 2 human legs. Larry had landed on his back, got his legs underneath this thing, and kicked up as hard as he could with all his might, sending this creature a good 3 meters into the air, forcing it to fly through the air, flailing as it did and landing on its back with a thud. As it began to get up, a shot rang out and it screeched in pain and then turned towards Vince, who was trying desperately to reload his rifle. As it looked over and growled at Vince, Larry ran up, jumped at it, and drove his knife into its neck right behind its ear, and then shifted hard one side and to the other. And that was it. The creature just stopped and dropped right there. Larry withdrew his knife and then jabbed it one more time in its back just to make sure it was done. He then picked himself up, wiped his knife on the hide of the creature he had just killed, and without putting it back in the sheath, walked back, realizing he still had his pistol in his hand. What none of us had known is when the creature landed, not only did the knife stick into this thing, but he had actually fired his weapon, but it was so deep into the musculature that the shot was muffled. That was the reason why it simply stood there. It couldn't move. It was trying to basically reboot from the hit. With that, they realized it was a bad idea to stay there, and they would have to make the walk early. They would have to get to the site where the VTOL would come to pick them up again. Same place they were taken to when they were dropped off. With that, they packed as much meat as they could, seasoned it, of course, with what they could left, and began to walk. This time, Femcast wouldn't have barely any supplies to carry. Most everything she had brought was expendable materials that they had already used. She didn't want any of the meat either, none of the hide. However, Greknar was more than interested in taking the hearts. She enjoyed the cooked hearts of these creatures. In fact, it was kind of creepy to watch her flip her head up and crunch on them like you would think a lizard would eating a cracker. It was something that made Larry and Vince both pause at the idea. They walked up the hill for a long, long ways, eventually finding where the VTOL was going to be. It was a rocky outcropping with not much there, and they knew they would have to set up camp, but they wouldn't be able to use their overhead cover. There was nothing to attach it to. They needed trees, they needed poles, and they didn't have any. They had fashioned all this stuff from the materials they had at their original site, but now they would have to stay put. They wouldn't be able to have a fire either. On this rocky outcropping, it was going to be a cold night. A cold night it was, in fact. Greknar and Femcast were basically curled up together. Femcast, being the smallest of them, was actually the warmest, as everyone else seemed to be curled up around her with her in the center. She would be telling everyone later that it was actually a surprisingly comfortable night, as they laid out on the rocks that had the few blankets they had underneath them to give some level of comfort. Throughout the night, Greknar would wake up every time Larry and Vince would trade off on their guard duties, seemingly every 2 hours, swapping that long rifle between the two. And then she heard something that she really didn't want to hear. Larry asked Vince, "How many we got left?" 2 was all he said after checking the magazine. They had 2 bullets left for that long gun. They only had 1 magazine left for the pistol, and of course their associated blades. But this didn't even seem to bother the humans. She was freaking the hell out. It was around dawn when she woke up. She looked around. She saw Vince was laying next to her, wrapped up around Femcast. And she looked, "Where's Larry?" She jumped up immediately, looking around. "Where is he? Where is he?" was all she thought. Where could he be? She got up, stood up, and was about ready to yell when she heard a little bit of movement and heard, "Shh." She looked around in the direction she thought it was, and "Larry, Larry, shh," he heard again. She realized that sound. That was a be quiet sound. And she was trying to be, but she was also freaking out. It's like, wait a minute, was that be quiet or was that I'm hurt? Greknar reached down and was about to shake Vince awake and then suddenly realized, "Don't do that." She then reached down to his feet and pawed at his feet a little bit, hearing Vince go, "What? Oh, was it my turn?" trying to wipe the sleep out of his eyes. He began to get up, and Femcast started to reach over and hold on to him, seemingly wrapping her arms and legs around him in perfect position for them to start doing things that would make everyone else uncomfortable. Vince stood up, with Femcast still holding on to his chest. "Oh, what? What's going on? What's going on?" "Shh," was all they heard, and with that, Vince was suddenly on edge, reaching down, grabbing the pistol, double-checking the safety, and putting his finger on the trigger. He stood there, with weapon down low, waiting. as they looked around. Where was he? Okay, they're gone, was all they heard. Larry then stood up from a small outcropping that you couldn't see unless you were almost on top of it. From here, he could actually see down into a valley that seemed to have something moving around. And then they realized that was the valley they came from. They looked, and Larry had his binoculars with him. Anything good? Vince asked. Oh, they found the bodies, as he handed the binoculars over to Vince. Vince held them up and said, oh, geez, they're having a fiesta for sure. With that, Gregnar was confused, but she looked over. Her vision actually allowed her to use almost telescopic lenses in her eyes. She could see many of the creatures of the forest were down there stripping the bodies of all the parts they did and didn't like. Not only that, but they were actually having fights down there about who would get the most tasty portions. They were glad not to be in the valley anymore. It was only an hour before the VTOL came in, and Gregnar was still confused about how the humans could be so calm in that situation. It just didn't make sense to her. After they picked up the two they had dropped off, they went back to the academy. Without skipping a beat, both humans looked at each other and said, all right, we'll see you tomorrow. I need a shower, and simply walked away. Femcast was still holding on to Vince and simply said, I can join you. And they walked away together, both laughing. Gregnar went back to her room and spent the entire night trying to process what she had seen, what had happened. Why? What? Huh? It wasn't until after her second class of the day this shell of a feline was walking around, and she didn't hear her name being called out. She didn't even see anyone in front of her waving at her, trying to get her attention. Not until someone walked up behind her so quietly she couldn't hear, and then grabbed her by the arm to get her attention. Jumping up, ah! Gregnar spun around and looked, and sure enough, there was Larry. Are you okay? Gregnar was in complete loss for words at that point. How did you sneak up on me? Like I told you before, I'm very, very sneaky. Oh, geez, don't ever do that again, please. With that, Gregnar was finally back to reality, not even realizing until she looked at the clock that she had mentally checked out of 2 classes. She eventually ended up in her 3rd class, sitting right next to Larry as they tried to discuss a little bit of what happened, but Gregnar really didn't want to talk about it. She was more interested in the fact that they were going into their new biome class, and she hadn't even gone over the materials yet, so everything was going to be fresh and new in her mind, and she definitely wanted good grades. She wanted good grades because her mother would kill her if she didn't. In one case, Larry worried about when she said that, would she actually kill you? No, it's a turn of phrase, figure of speech, something along those lines. Ah, but she will hit me really, really hard, several times. She might beat me until I can't walk. Please tell me you're joking. Nope. Larry was concerned about this, so he didn't bring up any more of what happened over the weekend. About a week later, Gregnar was sitting down with not only her brother, but her mother as well, along with one of her younger sisters, and an older sister. And they were having dinner. She actually served them steak, cooked over an open fire after being dry rubbed with black powder. This turned into a new speciality for their species, as they almost never, ever, ever seasoned their meat, and they only ate it raw. That was the way of things for them. They would never have thought of this. And as they ate it down and were all filled to the brim with so much and enjoyed every bite, Her mother asked, "Where did you learn how to do this?" "Well, the humans taught me." "Oh, that human male?" she said with a little vitriol in her voice. "Yes, mother, the human male." "You're not thinking about taking him as a mate, are you?" her sister asked. "No, I'm not, and that's not even possible anyway." "Why is that?" her mother asked. "Well, it's very simple. The humans don't find this attractive," as she moved her arms up and down her body. "Why not?" the youngest said. With that, Greknar's brother excused himself because he really did not want to be part of this conversation. With that, the girls seemed to giggle a little bit about this as it made him uncomfortable, yet continued. "Well, it turns out humans are visual creatures when it comes to that thing. They don't go by pheromones. Believe me, if it was, we would be having a very different conversation." With that, the eldest sister and the mother all of a sudden looked at each other and had a look of "oh shit" in her eyes. "Really? Really?" Gregnar simply shook her head in agreement. The youngest didn't quite get it, but kept her mouth shut and was simply listening to the conversation. "So, there is a way, though. I mean, I think Father would actually approve if that was the case. But I don't know if anything is going to work that way." "Well, your father would approve," her mother says. "In fact, your father has been looking into somehow finding a way to intermix the human genome into ours to make us an even stronger species. Of course, there are people who are fighting this inside the council chambers, as they want our race to stay as pure as possible. But it might be something else to mix it in. But no matter what we do, we can't seem to get everything to work. There's no actual conception that works with this. We're still confused on how that is. It seems like the humans have come to the same conclusion a long time ago, but I don't know how they figured it out so fast." With that, one of the girls chuckled at the idea. "Why, what is so funny?" The oldest sister said, "The humans are unbelievable geneticists. In fact, they've altered their bodies to the point of insanity. You would be amazed what they can do." The mother asked, "I haven't heard about this." Gregnar responded, "I've heard from it firsthand. Larry is actually over 100 of our solar cycles old." "But he looks so young," her mother said. "How is that even possible?" "I don't know," Gretnar says. Her mother turned towards her sister, and she simply shook her head. "No, she doesn't know either." "Apparently," Gretnar added, "it has something to do with genetic editing CRISPR. Crusader, whatever. They have a strange word for it. It doesn't translate, and our tongues don't exactly make it easy to say. But they're able to actually alter things. But apparently this comes with a lot of downfalls. But I would be willing to look into it." Her mother was completely and utterly shocked at this revelation. Would you really change yourself? Is that even possible?" "I don't know. But," she looked down and she seemed to blush a little bit, "I'm willing to find out." She then started swaying her tail in a way that every one of her species realized was a sign of infatuation. The young girl was in love. She was in love with another species, and this not only intrigued her mother and her sisters, but a little bit grossed them out. "We will have to discuss this with the council, your father, and everyone else, along with the humans themselves." "Okay, just, could you keep my name out of it for as long as possible?" "Oh, you know we will," her mother said, as that would be an extreme sign of embarrassment for everyone involved. 2 months later. You know, you don't have to do this. This is permanent. You know that, Larry was saying to Gretnar. I know, but it's an experiment for our two species. I I understand your thought process here, but I mean seriously, this is a one-time deal. You can't alter yourself back to your original form. It's not possible. Trying to bring you back to your original form will most likely bring out some very nasty genetic mutations. I mean, really bad. I mean, you're going to grow like two heads, 4 feet, five tails. You might be missing a limb. You might be missing organs. If you do this transformation, it's going to be messed up. It, you can't go back. Understand this. Larry was still flustered at the idea that Gretnar would want to change herself so that she could be with him, although she didn't say that was the reason. She only told him that it was about being closer to humanity, as sign of peace between the two species, as the two species originally had started butting heads, especially after how they had been totally embarrassed in the games at the Academy, which had become a comedy skit in human space. Also known as a internet meme. Gregnar was still trying to figure out what the hell that meant. Yet, she was willing to do this. As they walked into the embassy where it would be taking place, the other humans went and tried to stop Larry from advancing, but Gregnar simply raised her paw so that he could continue to walk until they reached the final destination. Larry continued to say, "You don't have to do this. It's okay. I mean, seriously, I don't know why you want to do this anyway. I know the whole peace thing, but I'm worried for you, okay? I'm worried that you're not gonna like what happens to you. And I don't want you deleting yourself because of this." Gregnar simply stopped and looked down at Larry. "Don't worry. I'll be fine. I want to do this." "A lot of people said that," Larry said. "Let her go, man. Just let her go," Vince said as he was right there, holding his arms around Femkes. Femkes not saying much at all, yet had the maternal glow of someone who was obviously 2 months pregnant. Larry simply looked down and at her and congratulated her quickly, and then simply went back to Vince. "Look, you know the percentages, okay? So you understand my intrepidation here. The last thing I need is to lose another friend of mine, to lose someone else, okay? I don't want to go through that again." "I get it, man, I get it, but it's her life. You can't just tell somebody what to do like that. If she wants to do it, I mean, seriously, she's going to have all of forever as long as she don't off herself to rethink what she's done. And you don't know what technology's going to do later." "Yeah, I know, but still, I can't help it, man. I can't help it. You know better than anybody. You should know." And with that, Larry pulled Femkes even tighter next to him. Femcast seemed to be a little concerned about this as she looked up with complete worry in her eyes. This is when Vince finally showed remorse. Not just compassion, but sadness was in his eyes. He was in deep thought for a moment. Larry realized that he had touched the nerve. "So I didn't mean to bring it up, man. I didn't mean to. But this isn't about us anyway. It's about her." As Larry turned around, he looked, and Gregnar was already gone. She had left during his rant and was already behind the security doors. Larry ran up, but the security personnel looked at him kind of sideways as he tried to get through the doors. You need a passcode and a security card to get through. He had one, but not the other. He simply reached up and pounded his fist on the wall a little bit. "Oh, shit." Vince walked up, put his hand on Larry's shoulder, turned him around and said, "Come on. It's going to take a few weeks before it's done anyway. Let me go buy you a beer." And as they walked out, Femcast actually turned to them both and said, "Hey, who knows? Maybe when she gets out, she'll be just as sneaky as the two of you."